Welcome to everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so.
You're right. So I should not have.
It's 7 o'clock, and so I think we'll go ahead and start. Good evening. My name is Annette Mills, and I am speaking tonight from Corvallis, Oregon, the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya people. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis, I would like to thank you all for being here. The purpose of tonight's program is to hear from our local political experts about the 2022 midterm elections, what happened, and why it happened. Our agenda for tonight is this. We'll start with a brief overview of the League of Women Voters and what we stand for. Then we'll hear briefly from our four speakers, all of whom are from OSU's School of Public Policy: Christopher Stout, Brent, David Bernell, and Catherine Bolzendahl. After each of our panelists has had a chance to speak, it will be your turn to ask questions of individual panelists and to the panel as a whole. Questions will be selected by Heath Kerstead, who serves on our local league board as publicity chair. So if you haven't already done so, please mute yourself and choose speaker in the view tab on your screen. I know for me, it's usually at the top of my screen. And this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the League's YouTube channel. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And our chat has been disabled because we just want you to put your questions in the Q&A, not into the chat. So, and now for our program. So what does the League do? Well, the League is League of Women Voters of the United States was founded in 1920, the year that women won the right to vote. The League is a nonpartisan grassroots political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. We never endorse or oppose political parties or candidates, but we are directly involved in educating people about the important issues that keep our communities and our country strong. For more than 100 years, the League of Women Voters has informed and studied and advocated on dozens of issues. We empower voters and defend democracy through education and advocacy. At the local, state, and national levels, we have standing positions on a wide range of topics. Our positions are arrived at only after comprehensive study, discussion, and agreement by our membership, and then we use our positions to influence public policy. But the League is probably best known for our work on empowering our citizens to become informed and active participants in the voting process. For example, last month, we held 2 voter forums to introduce voters to local candidates and to state ballot initiatives. During the state legislative session, we hold monthly legislative updates, typically on the first Saturday of the month from February through June, during the long session of the legislature, to give community members a chance to hear from our state senator and state representatives and to ask them questions. As I stated earlier, the purpose of tonight's program is to unravel the 2022 midterm elections, and we have 4 excellent speakers to help us do just that. None of our speakers are strangers to the League. They've all graciously appeared in past League programs to help us better understand questions related to politics, and we are very excited to have them all back with us tonight. Each of them has an impressive background in their education, their teaching, and their particular areas of interest. But for the sake of time, I've decided to simply introduce them by their titles. I do encourage you to look up their individual web pages, which are very impressive. So our first speaker, let me turn off my screen share here. Our first speaker is Christopher Stout. who is an associate professor of political science in the School of Public Policy at OSU, where he also coordinates the eCampus program. Welcome, Chris. You want to turn on your video and audio?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Annette. I'm going to share my screen if that is okay. Hopefully get rid of the notes on the side. Hopefully that's coming through. Thank you, Annette, and thank you for the League of Women Voters for inviting me out tonight and for organizing this event. Looking forward to discussing with my colleagues as well as all of you who are watching. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm just going to talk a little bit about why the outcome that happened on last Tuesday happened, with a focus on why didn't we see a larger red wave. And what usually happens in midterm elections is that the president party almost always loses seats in Congress. So I have a graph here to the left, and we can see for all elections, from the election of Harry Truman all the way up until 2018. And only 2 of those elections did the president's party gain any seats. In fact, on average, president's party loses between 20 and 30 seats between 20 and 30 seats in any given year. Why did the president's party lose seats? First, it's just a referendum on the party in power. People are unhappy with the way things are going. Then they want to vote people out of office. And the people that they want to blame are usually the president's party. There's also the advantage of if you're in the minority party or the party outside of the White House, you don't really have to put forth a vision that can be criticized. You just have to say you're going to be different. Whereas the president's party has to outline a vision or at least defend what they've done in the past. And once you get into the details of anything, there's a lot more that's objectionable, and that provides the party a disadvantage. Another big reason why you see the president's party lose is unequal enthusiasm. If your president shares your party, you feel like you already have kind of a safety valve in the legislative process. The president is going to veto legislation that you dislike, and so there's not the same sense of urgency to turn out. However, if the president is of a different party, then you want to check on presidential power and you want some say in the legislative process. And so you feel a real sense of enthusiasm and in some cases fear to turn out to make sure that your party has some say in government. And so the combination of factors means that if you're the party out of power, you're turning out at really high rates. And if you're the party in power, you turn out at really low rates. And the combination of which makes the party out of power have a huge advantage in elections. And then finally, there's some work that suggests that people kind of like divided government. Even though most voters want things to get done really quickly, they mostly like the idea of having more checks and balances. And so this leads a lot of independents to swing toward the party out of power in elections and provides them another advantage. So that's just traditionally the predictors that would lead to the party out of power doing better. But things can be worse or better depending on a couple of factors. The first is when the president is unpopular, then his or her party loses a lot of seats in a particular election. In part because the referendum on the president that occurs during these elections is worse when people don't like the president, and people can the opponents can attack the president's agenda a little bit more. So in this particular election, things weren't looking good for President Biden. Biden's approval rating was about 41%. That's similar to Trump in 2018 when he lost about 40 seats, and not dissimilar from Barack Obama in 2010 when he lost 63 seats. So in this case, things did not look good for Democrats. The other things are often worse when the people are pessimistic about the economy and about the future of the economy. If people are really worried about the way things are going, then the president and their party usually gets punished more at midterm elections. This is particularly true if the president is seen as being weak on addressing economic issues. And so in a Gallup poll taken in October 2022, about a month before the election, only 14% of people rated the economy as good or excellent. When asked about optimism about the future economy, things were around that as well. Just in about a dozen percent of individuals would say that they thought the economy was going to improve over time. To make matters worse for Democrats too was that people thought that the Republicans were much better stewards of the economy and felt that Biden's policies had kind of led to this growth of inflation and the economy that we have today. And then finally, things are worse when more incumbents retire. This wasn't as bad for Democrats, but a dozen more Democrats retired than Republicans. When more people retire, then you don't have incumbents, and incumbents generally are safer. In this particular election, every Senate incumbent may ultimately win, 100% of them. And this is more true in the House as well. But when incumbents leave, you have open seats, and there's more opportunities for the party out of power to win. So all of these things did not look good for Democrats. Not only was it a midterm year, and so you would expect Democrats to lose 20 or 30 seats anyway, but all of the things that were predicting to be worse than average should have occurred in this particular year. And so the fundamentals largely suggest that there would be a really large red wave. And we saw this in some public opinion polling before the election. We saw a lot of people who are political pundits saying that things were going to be really bad for Democrats on Tuesday. But that's not what we saw, right? Democrats retained the Senate, even though they were predicted to lose the Senate because they were defending more seats in competitive states like Arizona, and they had uphill battles in other states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But Democrats held on to the Senate and had the opportunity to actually gain a seat should Warnock win his runoff in Georgia in December. I keep looking. Republicans are highly likely to take the House. They only need one more seat to actually win the House, and that should happen today or maybe tomorrow. But Democrats will probably lose between 7 and 10 seats. So it's not a lot of seats lost. In fact, looking at presidential approval against seats lost or gained, if you're above this line, you did better than expected. If you're below this line, you did worse than expected. Biden did a lot better. So he's this bigger zero or bigger dot over here. He'd probably lose about 7 seats. And that's not dissimilar from George H.W. Bush, whose approval ratings were in the 60s and high 50s and lost about the same number of seats. So why didn't Republicans do better given that all the fundamentals suggest things would be worse? The first is most midterm elections are a referendum on the president, but in this particular case, it was also a referendum on the previous presidents. The Democrats spent a lot of time saying, look, this is Trump's party. And so if you dislike Trump, you can't vote for the Republicans. Or you dislike the direction that Trump took the country, don't vote for Republicans. And Trump is equally and maybe even more unpopular than Donald Trump. So here's the 538 polling average for how popular Donald Trump is. So if it's a referendum on Trump as well as a referendum on Biden, then the party in power or Democrats don't face as bad of odds to do well. And Trump is unlike any previous president in that people pay a lot of attention to Donald Trump. So it's been 2 years since Donald Trump has been in office, and these are kind of Google searches over time. You would expect that the president would get more searches and more interest would be in Biden versus Donald Trump, but they're pretty similar. And of course, if I look tonight, Trump, I think, just announced that he's going to run for president again not too long ago. So there's probably a peak where more people are searching for Trump than Biden during this period of time. And so the fact that it was a dual referendum on Biden and Trump kind of mitigated some of the losses that Democrats faced. The other thing is that there wasn't unequal enthusiasm to vote. So in most elections, in most midterm elections, the party out of power is much more enthusiastic to participate. In 2018, for example, there was about 11 to 12% more Democrats expressing that they're highly likely or barely likely to vote than Republicans. But in this particular election, it was pretty even. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, I think there was the January 6th commission and fears about threat to democracy, which really mobilized Democrats. But probably more important was the Dobbs decision this summer by the Supreme Court, which overturned Roe versus Wade. As soon as that decision was handed down, you saw a sharp increase in registration, particularly among young women who tend to be more supportive of the Democratic Party. And so that led to voter enthusiasm being pretty similar for Democrats and Republicans over time. And in fact, in some polls at the end, Democrats expressed more enthusiasm to turn out. And you can see that making a big difference in places like Oregon, for example, where Democrats outnumber Republicans in registration by 300,000 or 400,000. So if it's equal turnout between both parties, Democrats are going to win those elections. And that was true across numerous states where Democrats had those advantages. The other reason is that Republicans nominated candidates who were weaker. And of course, the Republican Party is having in some ways kind of a civil war, intra-party war with who are the best candidates to select. But they selected candidates that were largely supported by Donald Trump, who had problems that maybe weren't great fits for the elections they were running in. So, for example, here's a picture of Ahmed Oz, who was consistently painted as an outsider in Pennsylvania and had a couple of gaffes, which made it seem like he wasn't from the state, and that made him a weaker candidate than some of the others. Then I have Blake Masters and Herschel Walker, who have said controversial things in the past, and then J.D. Vance, who ultimately won in Ohio. And so if we look at how Trump candidates did, the Washington Post had an analysis. They have this red line here. If you're above this red line, you did better than expected. If you're below this red line, you did worse than expected. And the gold dots here are Trump nominated or Trump endorsed candidates. And we can see that for the most part, most Trump endorsed candidates did much worse than expected. And so Republicans nominated not the strongest candidates, which also mitigated some of the losses for Democrats. So I guess the takeaway from this for me is the fundamentals suggest a red wave, but there's also good reason to suspect that Democrats would do better than expected. And I think usually both sides feel demoralized at the end of an election season. And this time, maybe there's both sides have something to be happy about. Republicans can be happy because even a red ripple, not a red wave, gave Republicans control of the U.S. House. Democrats can be happy because they exceeded expectations. In the future, I don't expect there'll be much done legislatively because of divided government, and Democrats are unlikely to agree with Republicans, but Republicans are going to have a really small majority in the House. And so their ability to govern will also be a little difficult. And then finally, it was a bad night for Donald Trump, but a good night for his principal rival, Ron DeSantis. But I think it's going to set up a really interesting 2024 Republican primary. And in the last few days, we've kind of seen these two candidates go after each other. I will stop here, and I look forward to your comments and questions later.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Good overview. Really did a nice job setting the context for our other speakers. So our next speaker is Brent Steele, who is a University Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at OSU, where he also heads up the graduate program. And welcome to you, Brent. Nice to have you back.
Yeah, thank you, Annette, and thank you to the League of Women Voters. It's an awesome organization. So I've got some good news for League of Women Voters that I'm going to talk about first, and then I'll go to my my topic. So let me get this here, play my current slide. Okay, so so some of you I know are members and helped or around when we started Vote Smart, or it was called Project Vote Smart, back in the early 90s here at Washington State University. Oregon State University. I was at Washington State for a while, excuse me. And we relied on volunteers and on students to assemble a database that people could call in a free 1-800 number and get information on candidates that were running for office. And obviously, since then, we moved on to the web. I'm currently vice president of organization. I just got this information today from VoteSmart on the website use. And so when you compare the 2022 midterm election, the number of people that access the VoteSmart website compared to the 2020 general election, there's some very encouraging trends right here. So we had between this and normally, in the general election, the voter turnout's much greater. Interest in the election is much greater in the presidential election when compared to midterms. But so these data here are very encouraging, that people are interested in having nonpartisan, factual information that they can use when they're making decisions about who to vote for. We had an 8.56% increase in users overall between the general election and midterm election. We had a 12.5% increase in new users, which is very encouraging. We don't know exactly who they all are, but it looks like from the information we have so far that there were younger voters who were accessing the site. And then we had a 7.92% increase in page views. So very, very positive information concerning, people wanting to get facts and not conspiracy theories and such. And so if you want more information on this, just let me know. And if you haven't accessed Vote Smart, there's the link right there. You should go and have a look. And we've updated a lot of stuff on the website, candidate comparisons and such, but there's a lot of really useful information there. So I'm going to talk tonight about the rural-urban polarization divide in the current election. And this is a presentation that I've been giving for a long time now in Oregon and Pacific Northwest to community groups and watershed councils and all different kinds of groups. And so I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's like a 45-50-minute presentation, but I kind of updated a couple things just for talk tonight. And one of the things I do when I talk about this is I go through a lot of social science reasons why there is a rural-urban polarization in the U.S., economic, social, and political. And then at the end of this, I try to present some hope that there's ways that we can bridge some of this polarization. And so I start out with this slide here, where at the top here is a picture. This is from a Portland hipster website. And then on the bottom there is our Oregon Association of Oregon Loggers. And we can see some similarities here. We've got flannel, we've got some beards, we got some jeans. And so, there are some commonalities that we can focus on to bridge the divide somewhat. Over the years, and so this is hard to read, but these are data from 2022 from NBC. But this trend continues, and we can load up this slide, but there's been a trend where rural areas are going more and more Republican, more and more conservative, while urban areas are becoming more and more liberal, more and more Democrat nationally. In Oregon, it's very pronounced. In the 2020 presidential election, the dark blue Multnomah County there, this is percent vote for candidates for Biden and for Trump. And you can see the rural counties in the east and central and southern parts of Oregon were heavily Trump, while we have the university counties, Deschutes County has been turning purple, and the Portland metro area went for Biden. So very pronounced here. And one indication of this rural-urban divide is here's a story from 2020. There's this petition rally going on in the state on moving Oregon's border for a greater Idaho. And this is a story that appeared on KDRV out of Roseburg in 2020, and basically was talking about the petition was on the ballot there. And the point here is that a lot of the rural areas in Oregon don't identify with Salem and urban Oregon, and so they don't want to move to Idaho, so they want to move the border. And some of you may have seen this website. This is from the Greater Idaho petition movement. And so this is a map that they have on their website. Here's their particular goal of what they'd like to achieve. And so you see a lot of rural Oregon carved out to join Idaho, and then parts of Northern California. In the 2022 election, 2 more counties joined this movement. Morrow County, and this is to consider joining Idaho. They can't really do this. I mean, it's not going to happen. But Morrow County, 60% of the voters voted yes to do this, to consider it. And Wheeler County was 58.15% yes. And so this is from the Greater Idaho website. And so these are the counties now that voted to consider joining Idaho. And so once again, this is an indication of the rural-urban polarization and divide that we see today. If you're interested, there's a really good book by a political scientist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Catherine Kramer, and she wrote the book, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker. And so what she did, it's not the most scientific approach, but what she does is she goes to random coffee shops and churches and diners in rural areas, gas stations in Wisconsin, and just talks with people about what they're thinking. And she argues that this all, before the election of Trump, this rural resentment for rural areas was already there, just that Trump took advantage of it. And, she said she was really surprised by the intensity of it. But her general theme of what she writes about in the book is she talks about this concept of rural resentment. And it's basically rural areas, rural citizens resent, cities and urban elites, urban institutions like government and the media, because they don't represent what they think about, life, social issues and economic issues and such. And so one way to look at this in Oregon is this is from a chapter I wrote with colleagues at Western Oregon University and Portland State University, where we got data and looked at party registrations in Oregon by region. So we divide counties up by different regions. If you're interested in this, I can show you how we do this. But so this is Democrats as a percentage of major party membership by region. And so from 1968 up to 2020. And so the interest, there's some real interesting things here. So in Eastern rural Oregon, you see in 1968 was 56%. This data does not, this kind of throws out independents. So it's just looking at major party registration. So Republicans and Democrats. And so you can see in Eastern and Southern rural Oregon, you see a decline in Democratic Party membership. You can see mid-Willamette Valley, it went from 50, it's around 54, so not as much change. The North Coast, which has been a predominantly Democratic area, blue-collar working class area, it's been pretty much the same. Portland suburbs have increased in terms of Democratic membership. And then if you go over to the right and you look at Multnomah County, 82%, in 2020 compared to 60%. There's very few places in the US where you're going to see Democratic membership like that. So this kind of just shows the party membership by area. And then I just got some examples from the recent election. I got some data from Secretary of State's office yesterday and today. And so I just thought I'd give an example of on the most recent election, how this turned out. And so you can see for the recent governor's election, and these are the current data we have, and these will change a little bit, but for urban counties. So if you look at county by county results in the state, you can see the two university counties, Benton and Lane, and then Multnomah County kind of helped decide elections statewide. And you can see here that Tina Kotek got almost 60% in Benton County, 52% in Lane, and 72.5% in Multnomah, which is huge. And then we had this three candidate race, and if you've looked, there's information you can online. You can see maybe one of the other people will talk about it, presenters, but Betsy Johnson really declined the last couple of weeks in support. Which I think helped Kotek a bit, but you can see Drazen, you can see only 19.7% Multnomah County, less than 40% in Benton Lane County, and then Johnson around 7%, a little bit higher in a couple of counties. Then when you look at rural counties, and when I was doing this today, I had a previous slide with the last gubernatorial election, and these numbers really didn't change that much, even though you had Betsy Johnson in the mix. You can see Crook County, for example, 73.8%, Lynn County, 62.8%, Wallowa County, 68.4%. I see a similar pattern with the U.S. Senate. So once again, this pretty much breaks down by all the counties, but I didn't do all 36 counties. You can see Wyden won by over 60% in Lane and Benton County, and almost 80% in Multnomah County. And then Perkins, the Republican candidate, you can see did not do well, 36.2% in Lane County, which has a relatively large rural area in comparison maybe in the Benton County. And then the rural counties you can see are overwhelmingly going for Perkins. So very strident results when you look at urban versus rural. And then so we had the four ballot measures this year. And the first one, the right to health care amendment to the Oregon Constitution. So it passed in a relatively close vote, 50.6% yes, 49.4% no statewide. And you can see it broke down. You can see that Benton, Lane, and Multnomah County up to 69% majorities were in favor of that. Lane County 45.2% against, but you can see that there were majorities in urban counties. And then going down to the three example rural counties, you can see it's overwhelmingly no on that particular amendment. When the provision, the amendment, the ballot measure on removing slavery or indentured servitude as punishment for crime, moving that from the Constitution, you can see overwhelmingly supported in the urban counties, Benton, Lane, and Multnomah, clear up to 78%. And then in the rural counties, overwhelmingly opposed at almost equal percentages. So quite a stark contrast. For the exclusion from elections, so we had this issue with Republicans. We have this quorum rule in Oregon, and even though the Democrats had a supermajority in the last couple of legislative sessions, they didn't have a quorum with all the Republicans, if all the Republicans left. And of course, that's what they did on multiple occasions the last couple of sessions. And so you can see in urban counties that passed to this particular ballot measure passed 68.3 to 31.7% statewide. And then once again, just looking at our example, urban counties and rural counties, this is kind of a little bit surprising actually. So it passed at over 73% in the three counties in Benton, Lane, and Multnomah. It also passed in rural counties, but not by as large a margin, but you can still see some rural urban differences there. And then this is the one that I think is we're going to be reverberating in politics in Oregon for quite a while, and it's on the changes to firearm ownership and purchase requirement initiative. And these are some of the most stringent gun control measures in the U.S. And you can see in Benton County, it passed almost 60% to no 40%, 54% in Lane County, and then 74.1%. And then going down to the rural counties, it's 80.5% Crook, 69.8 Lynn, and then 73.2% Wallowa counties. And once again, you can go on the state Secretary of State's website and look at county by county results on this. But this is, I think I did a lot of driving around pre-election in rural areas, and there are a lot of signage up in rural areas on this. So, and then finally, something to think about when you look at these measures that were passed, and we're looking at the percentages, but then when you start looking at the actual number of people that voted on the measures, so in Benton County, which relatively small, 44,000 around. Lane, larger county, 176,000, almost 177, and Multnomah, almost 360,000. And compare it to the three rural counties that I had in the tables there. So when you start looking at percentages and look at actual numbers voting on these, you can see the impact of urban area preferences over rural area preferences. And so one would expect that the urban-rural divide, and I have other things like on marijuana legalization, magic mushroom legalization, it's the same kind of results. And so going back to the Greater Idaho movement, you can see once again why people are feel like they're disenfranchised, or that urban areas don't listen to them. So that is about all I'm going to talk about right now. And then what I normally do at the end of this presentation, I give it to community groups as I show that some of you might be familiar with the Portlandia video. Is it local or not, about the people that go out and buy chicken at a restaurant? And then there's a piece in New York Times Magazine, and I can put this up so you have access to it, that is kind of a funny thing, but will Portland always be a retirement community for the young? So so that's all I have at this particular time. Thank you.
All right, we'll come back to you shortly, Brent. Thanks so much. It was really some startling data about the width of the rural-urban divide. On the positive side, we're really happy to see the increase in the use of Vote Smart. So that was good. Our next speaker is David Bernell, who is an associate professor of political science in the School of Public Policy at OSU. Welcome back to the League. David, nice to see you again.
Thank you, Annette. It's good to be here. Thanks to the League of Women Voters and to all of the people who are here this evening. I see on my screen that there are over 100 participants here. So it's great to have everyone. I think what I'll do is kind of pick up on some of the things that Chris was talking about in his presentation, because this really was a surprise in this election, right? The biggest surprise for me and many people is just how well the Democrats did in key Senate and governor's races, and what looks like it's going to be a pretty small margin for the Republican majority in the new Congress. The Democrats really did outperform expectations. And I think that they bucked what is one of the few solid predictions that people can make in politics. The law of political gravity that says that the party in the White House tends to lose pretty significantly in the midterm elections, especially in the second year of a new president, right? And as Chris had pointed out, this was, he pointed out a number of the reasons why this was such a surprise, right? Trump, in an unusual kind of circumstance, was himself in some ways on the ballot. The GOP, the Republican brand isn't very strong. They had a lot of poor candidates, abortion motivated people, and seemed to make a bit of a difference. And sometimes polling is harder to figure out these days with with fewer and fewer people responding to pollsters. It's also the case that a handful of polls that lean kind of heavily Republican came out about a week before the election. There's even been some speculation that this was an intentional strategy to put out some GOP-linked polling to both encourage their own voters and make the Democrats a little more despondent and less motivated to vote, although that's just been some speculation at this point. It's also the case that turnout was pretty high in comparison to most midterm elections. And this time, young people voted in decent numbers. They tend to sit out more of the midterm elections, and they voted very heavily Democratic. So there were a whole bunch of things that went into this. I think one of the data points that really kind of exemplifies the way in which the results of this election turned out is that in this case, independent voters broke for the Democrats. And this is usually a group that moves away from the party that's in the White House in the midterms. So Democrats here really did something no one's done for almost 20 years, and they did well with voters who, quote, somewhat disapprove of the president. So when polling is out there before, they're like, what's your approval of the president? Do you approve, somewhat approve, whatever. For voters who somewhat disapprove of the president, these voters tended to vote more Democratic this time than that group has done in the past. So in 2002, in one of the graphs that Chris showed, it showed one of the few times that the president's party got won seats in the House during the midterm elections. But ever since that time, since 2006, the president's party has lost this group of people who somewhat disapprove of the president by 20 percentage points or more in every midterm since this time in the exit polls, when people say, do you prefer, the Democrats or the Republicans? On Tuesday, however, in the election, the Democrats won this demographic by 4 points, according to the exit polls. So instead of losing by 20 points or more, the Democrats won them by 4 points. So this was pretty significant and a good indicator of one of the things that went well for the Democrats that night. There were just enough people who said, I'm not going to vote Republican for a lot of these reasons that Chris was talking about and that I mentioned just real briefly a few minutes ago. So you've got a situation, right, where the country is both very closely and deeply divided, and while swing voters will have a very huge say, or they can have a huge say in who wins in these elections, in close elections, but in some cases their numbers seem to be smaller, right? It's that it seems that people know who they're going to vote for, and there's a lot of staying power to this, at least recently. Those loyalties seem to be very strong for most voters. Now, there was an interesting element to this that I want to bring up that some people were talking about just prior to the election and then after the election, and it had to do with some of the really extreme or MAGA candidates that the Republicans nominated. And that some people, including Mitch McConnell, saying candidate quality matters. And one of the things that happened during the primaries is that the Democratic Party ran some commercials that the way they were described is they were supporting the more extremist or right-wing MAGA candidates running for positions, say for Senate or governor in Pennsylvania or in other positions. And there was some significant criticism of this. Now, the Democrats' message when they aired these ads didn't say, "Hey, vote for Carrie Lake or Mastriano in Pennsylvania," for example. What they said was, "This candidate is very conservative, much too conservative. Trump supports this person. They're much too extreme. They support the MAGA movement." It's the same, and they're too conservative for the country. And this is the same message that the Democrats were making consistently about these candidates in the general election, but they were considered to be supportive ads because they let the voters, the Republican voters, know in these contested elections, in these contested primary elections, who was Trump's person. It was seen as being at least somewhat helpful to those candidates to help them gather the support in the primaries so that they won. And the criticism of this, and the more common criticism, or the reaction, the more common reaction, suggested that the Democrats were really playing with fire, even though a lot of these candidates lost. But the Democrats were kind of reckless and dangerous, right? And that the criticism is that they were playing fast and loose with our democratic future, right? I mean, considering how bad so many of these candidates seemed to be and how much voters rejected them considering how bad the Democrats were saying these candidates were, the thought was it wasn't wise to let them get too close to power. So helping to put them in a position where they could win the nomination was just irresponsible. And this is a criticism that the Democratic Party has faced since those primary elections. And the people who have been making those critics, like if you're reading some of the newspapers or seeing some of the commentary on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, things, well, probably not Fox, or MSNBC, this was the comment they're making, saying even though the result tended to work out okay for the Democrats, maybe this was irresponsible. But there's a counter argument to that as well, and I don't think it's gotten as much airtime. And that I think that this was part of the Democratic Party's calculation here. But when you consider just how willing, so-called normal Republicans have been over the last several years to go along with everything that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement Republicans have wanted, you can make the argument that there's really little functional difference between the normal Republicans and the extreme MAGA Republicans. And so it could be argued that the bigger threat to democracy might very well be the Republicans who try to act normal or resist some of the worst of the kind of Trumpist or MAGA movement Republicans. But in the end, they happily go along with the election deniers and all the things that are seen to be weakening democracies. And so the thought could be that it's this larger mass of cowardly Republicans who've really created the numbers for terrible things to happen. So it's much better for by the Democratic Party's calculation, to have the election deniers and the more extreme members of the Republican Party be those candidates. So this was, I think, an interesting dynamic of one of the things that happened in this election. And now going forward, right, there are going to be some interesting kinds of circumstances as well. The person who I think, gets the name, oh, poor Kevin, right? Kevin McCarthy is probably seen as, even though he will likely be chosen as the Speaker of the House, people don't seem to think that he's in a really good situation. And I agree with this. Kevin McCarthy, I think, has really not really shown any integrity or leadership until now, so it's probably not expected in the future. And because of the incredibly close margin that is expected to be there in the House of Representatives, it seems that in order to secure the job of Speaker, Kevin McCarthy is probably going to have to do whatever the most extreme members of the GOP caucus want so he can hang on to that job of Speaker. And I expect that, there will be tons of investigations of everybody in the Biden administration. The GOP majority in the House will probably take impeachment proceedings for a test drive, probably by going after the Secretary of Homeland Security first. And if that doesn't blow up in their faces, they may go after impeachment of Biden. However, it may be the case that the slim majority could make this a little harder. Although on the other hand, we really haven't seen a lot of examples of restraint among the House Republicans. Because the House is going to be so closely divided, and because the voters themselves are so closely divided and really so deeply divided, it's going to, I think, make cooperation even more difficult, to the extent it's already difficult in Congress. Although, President Biden, to his credit, kind of got some things passed that people didn't think he was going to get passed by getting some Republican votes in the Senate. But in the House, I think it's even tougher. And I think part of the problem here is just how close and how deep the division is. I think about how the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives from 1954 to 1994. That actually produced greater opportunities for bipartisanship and cooperation. And clearly it was a different era than we're in today. But the nature of those close divisions actually makes it tougher for any kind of work, I think, to happen across party lines. And the reason is, when a party is in the minority and it knows it's going to be in the minority for a while, it has an incentive to cooperate, right? This is the only way you're going to get some amendments passed or any kind of say in what happens in legislation. But when the parties are so evenly split, there's really less incentive to cooperate, because the next election, it may be the case that the minority party will be in the majority, right? And we have a situation right now where this is pretty consistent over time. People aren't changing their votes very much. They're staying with their team, even when policies and positions change. And with such close equality in the support for both parties, right, it only takes a small number of people changing their votes in any election to have a huge change in outcomes. So rather than trying to get some legislation passed or get a few of your party's priorities into some piece of legislation, parties are much more willing to take the issue rather than any kind of movement on the legislation to hold out for the next election where they might be a majority. One of the things that I think even more immediately is coming up is this lame duck session of the Congress. Because I think what we're seeing now is calls for the Democratic-controlled Senate and House to pass a few things before a new Congress gets seated. And I think one of the big things that is likely to happen and come up for a vote is an increase in the debt ceiling. Although my preference would be to just eliminate the requirement altogether before a new Congress is seated. It's kind of I think it's kind of a ridiculous thing that we have in this country, where we can vote a budget in that allows for deficit spending, but then have to separately increase the debt limit. And it just seems to have invited opportunities for trouble to occur. So I would certainly be supportive of the Democrats eliminating this requirement, but I do think they're probably going to have a vote to at least raise the debt ceiling to some point beyond the next 2 years. Anyway, I think I will stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Katie Bolzendahl.
All right. Thank you, David. Really interesting point you made, especially about the influence of swing voters and Democratic strategy, among other points that you made. So our final speaker is Catherine Bolzendahl, who is the director of the School of Public Policy and a professor of sociology at OSU. Welcome, Catherine.
Unmute. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So this slide is a little bit to remind. So as a sociologist, I tend to approach these issues a little bit more abstractly and a little bit less in the weeds on specific campaigns or political fights that are happening and thinking about some of the bigger kind of theoretical issues and trying to tie that into the election results. Like many of us, I'm still scrambling to make sense of them all and looking at the data, and it's changing hourly. So it makes it very interesting. But if we take stock a little bit and look at where women are in Congress and going into this election, and it looks like fairly similar coming out of this election, we see that about 28% of congressional seats are held by women, and the vast majority of those are held by Democratic women. And so although women hold a minority of the seats, they mostly go to Democrats. And when you look overall, I have this chart here going back to 1946 as a percent of, to try to get up to 50%, then we're not, we're still quite a ways away from that, although we continue to make slow and steady progress. But I just, wanted to highlight that there's still a lot of work to do. The US ranks 69th in the world for women's representation in the House of Representatives in the lower house. We're tied with Iraq. We're behind Mexico, the UK, and Canada, for example. So there's still a lot of work to be done, despite some of the successes that we've seen. And, certainly in Oregon, seeing 3 women run for governor was a nice thing to see for those who support more women in office. So, but when we think about this question of, does it matter that women are running for office? Does it matter that we're electing women, that we have 3 women running for governor, or women winning various seats that were unexpected across the country? So as a political sociologist who focuses on gender, I look at the aspects of descriptive representation, substantive representation, and symbolic representation. So descriptively, I'm really interested in those numbers that I started off with. Do we see that the percent of women who are ending up in political office match the percent of women who are in the population who are voting? And so here's one exit poll data that I just pulled. Overall, women outvote men 52% to 48%. And this is a trend that's been happening for some time. And in some of my work, I've shown that this extends to other European democracies as well. So the idea that women are less involved in politics, at least when it comes to voting, is not true anymore. Women are much more likely to vote Democrat, and men are more likely to vote Republican. And so that's just overall, so that masks a lot of important trends when it comes to race and ethnicity, for example. So Black women overwhelmingly vote Democrat, about 88%, I think in one of the exit polls I was looking at, of Black women voted Democrat, and a very high percent of white women and, of course, white men are voting Republican. And I have some more numbers we could look at there. I mean, one of the things that I do that I think, all of us can do is you just look at some of these exit polls. ABC News has some good exit polls on this broken down by gender and race. And we can see that there's a lot of variation there. And so what we see is that although women are more likely to vote Democrat, and so we could say that the high proportion of Democrats who are being elected reflects that trend of where women are voting, it's certainly not reflecting that for Black women or other women of color, because you only have, trying to remember the number off the top of my head, about 6% of women in Congress who are Black women, and those are all Democrats, but they're voting 88% Democrat. So it really is important in the US to kind of break down some of those things, but we do see some evidence for descriptive representation. Now, substantive representation is this idea that if you elect women, is there a reason that you elect women because you think that they're going to better represent the some kind of women's interests, that they, that they're going to substantively bring something different to the table if you elect them? And so one of the things that we see in the US and in a lot of democracies is that the issues that are owned by the left, in this case by the Democratic Party, tend to already favor women. So you saw some of the slogans out there row your vote, right? So you should vote for a woman, you should vote for a Democrat because that's going to protect your reproductive rights. And it's your vote to make sure that happens. And of course, what we saw is that in the elections where it really felt like reproductive rights were on the ballot, that they were at risk, you saw Democrats really outperforming Republicans in those elections. And that's part of what led to kind of the surprise in the results that we saw. So it really did matter that a large group of women and of men felt that these were issues that they really had to vote very carefully about, think very strategically about supporting those rights. But it becomes hard to disentangle, right? Is it about women? Is it about the left? Is it about the Democratic Party? Because really, when we think about substantive representation, there are still a lot of struggles over women's social roles and how that translates to politics. So I have a picture here of a woman at a DeSantis rally, and she's holding up a sign that says "Mamas for DeSantis." And so we've seen that when we saw Sarah Palin, the Mama Grizzly Bear, and some of these other figures on the right who use women who use their motherhood, some kind of traditional notion of femininity, and they want to see that substantively represented. And they feel that those candidates are actually who are bringing their interests to bear as well. So when we talk about this question, it becomes a little thorny. And it really does tie into what I would say is the third aspect of this, which is how gender can be used to symbolically represent issues. And so here I'm calling this Women of the MAGA Right, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek of a book that was written in 1987 by a political scientist named Rebecca Klatch. And she wrote a book called Women of the New Right. And she really talked about how in the Republican Party, you had kind of these laissez-faire Republican women who did not want their representation to be about the fact that they were women, but you also had then the social conservative women who really campaigned as women, but for traditional roles. So in a way, they were campaigning against their own representation in politics, because they did really advocate for women to be home and with family. And so I think the issues have clearly changed in that time, and but some of the threads remain the same. And so when we look at a Lauren Boebert or a Marjorie Taylor Greene or Carrie Lake, they are using in some ways their gender and their status as women, as religious, as family, to appeal to men on things that they know that they can appeal to conjure up images of traditional femininity, of protecting family, of being involved in those kind of relationships. And so it becomes the use of these symbols of throwing away your mask, of having an automatic rifle, of having the gun holster and the cross in the back. So that kind of pressure exists, and it really does tend to push out other representations. So women who are in the Republican Party who are more moderate, who are more kind of neoliberal in how they view things, those voices aren't heard as much, and it's harder for them to make a case as women because they're not trying to kind of buy into this whole set of symbolic representation that's occurred through the MAGA movement. So those are a few of the things I think about. I would say women are definitely in the game. We've seen, I've got a PhD student right now who she's been tracking record-breaking interest in women campaigning. So Emily's List, which supports women going into election, has had 1,000% increase in women who are interested in running for office and being involved in campaigns. So I think to the question of how do we get young people interested, I think they are interested, and we bring them in early into these campaigns and to running for office. I think the question really remains about whether women's voices will be voices for change or whether it will continue to be a status quo, given so many of the sticky institutional frameworks and barriers that we see. So I'll certainly be watching. I know you'll be watching, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Katie. Stay on, and we're going to bring back our other three panelists. And I see we have quite a few questions in the Q&A. And so I'm going to ask Heath, what's our first question?
There are some
here?
questions about independents and their vote. So are they swing voters, or are independent voters more like for one party or another?
Brent, do you want to take that one? Unmute and
I think Chris and Dave know this better. than
okay.
I.
Okay. All right. Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, there's been, I think, a lot of political science work looking at who the independents are. And increasingly that work is showing that independents are just shy partisans, that they don't like the political parties. So they say, oh, no, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. If you ask who they voted for in the last 3 elections, consistently they voted for Democrats, or on the other hand, consistently voted for Republicans. There's some estimates that probably 4 or 5% of the population is actually floating voters that go from one side to the other. So I think your estimate of 90% is pretty close. That most people who are partisan obviously vote for their party, and most independents are partisans as well.
All right, David, you want to add anything to that?
Sure, but in thinking about the Oregon context, that I think was also pretty interesting. I mean, if you look at where Betsy Johnson did in the state, when you looked at polling much earlier in the year, Betsy Johnson was polling, at 20% or more, when the possibility of her as a real alternative to the Democratic and Republican parties, seemed more possible, and also kind of a new independent candidate seemed more interesting. But as Chris pointed out, people who call themselves independent tend to consistently vote for one party or another. And when you look at Tina Kotek kind of pulling off a victory, right? It was close, but it looked even closer about a week before the election, right? I mean, the Democratic registration is certainly higher in Oregon than Republican registration, but the Democrats turned out a lot more voters than Republicans in this election. It's estimated almost 180,000 more registered Democrats turned out in this election. It's also the case support for Johnson dropped several points below what some of the late polling was showing. Like I said, about a week before the election, maybe 11 or 12 points was her support, and that made the margin between Tina Kotek and Christine Drazan very, very thin. But the thing is, right, in a very polarized society where people have very strong party loyalties and they strongly dislike the other side, voters tend to become more strategic as election day gets closer. And it just seems like there were enough Democrats in this election who may have been entertaining the independent vote for Betsy Johnson, but they kind of got religion in the last week and decided they couldn't let a Republican become governor. So they voted for Kotek in the end, and Betsy Johnson ended up with closer to about 8 or 8.5%. And those reductions in her numbers in that last week or so tend to coincide pretty closely with Tina Kotek's margin of victory.
Interesting data. All right, Heath, what do we have next?
Well, a question about young voters and the role young voters play, why they were voting more. I think there was some information at the beginning about young voters turning out to vote. But then also, how do we keep young voters engaged if their issues aren't getting a lot of momentum and action?
Who wants to start with that one?
Well, from what we're looking at the Vote Smart hits on the website right now, from what we know, there's heavily young voters, and the abortion issue was really, that page got hit time and time again on the issue page. So that's some, and we don't have final numbers on that yet, but it looks like that was especially among women, that was a huge driving point.
And the second part of that question was how to keep them engaged. Catherine, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the more that young people see themselves as being able to get involved in politics and to run for office, and that they're really interested in being the change that they want to see, I think that that's a really important process. Like I said, some of these organizations are doing a lot to recruit younger people to learn how to campaign, to learn how to run a campaign, be involved in one. How do you do all the things you need to do to be in that position? And so working on that farm team, I think, is really important and will help people stay engaged.
I think we saw that in our local elections here in Corvallis too. All right. Anybody else want to chime in on that one, David?
There's a couple of things. One is, when young people see that, that their participation makes a difference, right, as it did in this election, and even seeing, young people get elected. So there's a guy named Maxwell Frost, I believe is his name, who is 25 years old. He was born in 1997, and he's the first member of Generation Z to get elected to Congress, right? And that's significant, and that can be motivating. I also think the abortion issue is pretty interesting too. And I just wonder if this has some longer term impacts that really harms the Republican Party when they have these very kind of, I would say, extreme views with regard to abortion, where a lot of laws that are being passed have very short timeframes, like 6 weeks when someone could have an abortion, which might be before even someone knows they're pregnant. And not making exceptions for case of rape or incest or the life of the mother. Like these are pretty extreme positions out there, even for where the Republican Party has been recently. And I wonder if there's some long-term impacts to that, because you think about younger people, younger women, younger families who are thinking, or younger couples who are thinking about having families, and they know that this party is supporting some what could be really significant restrictions and problems for this family's decision making. And if a woman has a miscarriage, there's a concern that she could be prosecuted for this. And I'm wondering if this issue has some longer term impacts beyond this election for this reason.
All right, thank you. Catherine, Katie, did you want to say something
Well,
else?
I was just going to comment because I realized something I meant to comment on, and David reminded me, is that the extremism, and I think that really drove people in a lot of drove a lot of voting to see that those extreme viewpoints out there, because they're really out of step with especially how young people feel, but how a lot of Americans feel. Americans are just not as extreme as you're seeing the messaging come out of here. And I'm basing that on having studied social attitudes, since for the past like 30, 40 years, looking at these trends. Women are consistently very supportive of social investment, of, same-sex rights, of, reproductive rights. And men, actually, if you look at the trends in most recent years, are catching up to women. So the trend of the American society and the trend of these candidates are really out of whack. So.
All right, good point. All right, Heath, what's next?
Is there a movement to start using population density plots to show political leanings instead of painting large swaths of areas red or blue, et cetera?
I think that's yours, Brent, this rural-urban divide, because the maps definitely make it look like, whoa, 7/8 of Oregon voted Republican, when it's geographically that may be true, but not population wise. What would you need to unmute if you want to say something? Thanks.
Yeah, I just see this is getting worse, not better. The rural urban divide. And I don't, you see some areas, like in Oregon here, Deschutes County, and Hood River have changed because of influx of population. But then in other areas in the state, the rural counties have a really hard time. I mean, economically, they have several have lost population or stagnant population. It's just it's hard to see. I think there's ways to overcome that. In Oregon, we've done some things, I think, that are are sensible. Like in terms of well, I just drove over to Walla Walla, and so one of the things people in rural Oregon want to drive faster and pump their own gas. So once you get over in Eastern Oregon, legislature's made provisions where you can pump your own gas, and you can drive 70 miles an hour. And we've done some things like that, or the opt out of legal recreational marijuana. We've done a lot of things like that, and we've been, and I know that you've been involved in watershed councils, which is a unique Oregon approach to trying to bridge the rural urban divide. And we have and collaborative governance. So we have, in Malheur County, when we had the occupation by the kind of property rights extremists, the Collaborative Governance Association still functioned there during that time. I mean, they're trying to work together and to promote both economic development, but also at the same time economic protection. So I think there's things that we've done that try to bridge that, but it's still, it's with like if some of these measures passing again in the Oregon context and other Western states too. It's it's hard to see how things are going to change that much, but
Right.
we'll see.
Has there been any effort visually to represent the state in a way that, doesn't represent it as it actually is, but in terms of the population density, so that Multnomah would be a lot bigger and some of these eastern counties would look a lot smaller on the map, so it doesn't look quite so lopsided.
Yeah, no, there are things, but it's kind of really hardcore academic research that does that.
Okay.
So, and I'm involved in a project right now looking at wildfire mitigation efforts and stuff inside Oregon, and we're doing that right now. But but this mostly, I haven't seen a lot of that in the political sphere or the popular sphere.
Yeah, Chris, I saw you nodding your head. Do you want to add anything there, or?
Oh, no, I just agreeing with Brent that it's like you see these graphs, but it's not common, I think, in the popular press. It's mostly in academic journals.
Okay, all right. Okay, thanks. Heath?
While the Democrats did well in many Oregon races, they didn't do well in county commission races for the most part. Are there any reasons that you have for that?
Anybody? I didn't know that was the case. That's an interesting point. I guess we don't have anyone who wants to speak to it.
Okay.
All right.
The next thing is just a lot of people had some comments around, there was a slide Brent put up with a number, like I think it was the number of voters per county in Lynn County and Lane County, et cetera. And I think there was some there. So where it said that there were more voters in Lynn County than the population size of Lynn County. So
there were people raising questions about
people were
those
raising
numbers.
I'll check on that.
Yeah.
I think there was a question, wasn't there, about gerrymandering and the impact on voting in Oregon related to gerrymandering? Seems like I saw that.
I don't see it yet, but maybe somebody has an answer to that.
Yeah, right. Actually, it might be interesting to ask on a national scale what impact gerrymandering had. Anybody? Yeah, Chris?
I have some thoughts about that. Yeah, it had, I think, a really large impact. I think especially when things came down, if it comes down to just 7 states, right? And so Florida, for example, is able to get a map the courts rejected the map that was initially put out, and they put forth a much more aggressive map. I think Republicans gained 3 seats there. Tennessee also had an aggressive map, which allowed them to gain an additional seat. Then you had a couple of majority Black districts that got struck down by the Supreme Court, one in Alabama and I believe one in North Carolina. That's another 2 seats. New York put forth a very aggressive Democratic gerrymander, which got struck down by the courts, and that would have given Democrats an advantage. And so you can see all the decisions that were made, particularly when the split is so small, would have swung things the other direction. So had the Supreme Court not struck down those majority black districts, had the courts not struck down Florida's initial map, or that the courts not struck down New York's initial map, then you would have a different, you certainly would have a different outcome. Democrats would likely be holding on to the House. So it had a pretty large impact. The map became a lot fairer than it was in the past, than the previous previous period of time, but it still isn't, it still means Democrats have to win generally a little bit more of the national vote to get the majority.
All right. Anyone else want to comment on that one? All right, Heath, next question.
Given the greater difficulty in access to healthcare in rural areas, are you surprised by the overwhelming rural vote of no for Measure 111?
Okay, so that's probably directed towards me.
Yes, I would say that's yours.
Yeah, well, yeah, yes and no. So, government, government healthcare is a controversial issue in a lot of conservative areas in the US. And that's kind of what the book, Kathleen Kramer's book, is getting at, is trying to, explain why someone that's against programs for the poor, health programs for the poor, education and stuff, gets elected by that constituency. And the same thing like with Trump, people voting for him that would actually benefit from Democratic policy. So there's a lot of literature on that, and it's culture wars, and ideology is a real powerful thing when making decisions or judgments on policy preferences. It's probably one of the most, typically in political science, that's the most important variable typically on people's preferences, is their ideological orientation. So once again, we need more people to go to Vote Smart and League of Women Voters and do their homework, and then vote rationally for their own self-interest.
Thank you. We appreciate that comment. David, did you want to say anything?
Well, and with regard to the measures, right, another one where there was just a huge divide in the same way was Measure 114, which puts some restrictions on on gun ownership. So, this requires a permit from law enforcement for people to purchase firearms. And, the licensing component, it requires the gun purchasers complete a firearms safety training course. They have to have an application with fingerprints at their local police department. Then law enforcement reviews the application, runs a background check. There was just a huge divide in Oregon, and as and around the country there would be if a measure like this was put up in other states, where you would hugely see this rural urban divide as well. This is an interesting measure in the sense that I think people around the country are looking at this one. The gun control advocates are saying, hey, there's actually a path forward. Maybe there's some ways in which we can get some more restrictions in place. And the kind of, the strong Second Amendment supporters have a real world example here of in Oregon. It's like, hey, the liberals are coming to take your guns away. So I think that this one is going to have an interesting example for a lot of people. And again, will really exacerbate that rural urban divide. Another thing I saw, there was a paper that was done a few years ago, and the person essentially who wrote it, I can't remember the details, tracked population density and whether a county voted for Trump, or it was probably Hillary Clinton, because I think it was done before 2020, and they found that, if a county has less than, 500 people, or if an area has less than 500 people per square mile, it's voting red. And if it has more than 1,500 people per square mile, it's voting blue. And then there's that sweet spot in the middle that tips kind of around 700 to 800 in general people per square mile. And it was, really kind of consistent data that showed this one measure is a great predictor of voting patterns.
Interesting. As a follow-up to the question on Measure 114, is it your expectation that this is going to be challenged in the courts, or are we actually going to see it implemented? I
think the answer is yes to both of those. It's going to be challenged in the courts, but ultimately will probably survive.
All right.
Although
Okay.
the recent Supreme Court ruling last year could put some more of that in danger when they struck down a New York law.
Right. That's what I
about
was
voting.
wondering. Yeah.
But I think it can ultimately survive.
All right, Heath, we have time for a few more questions.
Any thoughts on how ranked choice voting might have played out in the governor's race?
If you mean if we had ranked choice voting
I think that's what it was.
at the state level. We do have it here locally in Corvallis and Benton County, but if it were at the state level, what might have happened? Anybody want to take a wild guess?
Right, I think it would be the same outcome, I think, right? I haven't seen exit polls in Oregon, but most of what we know about voting behavior would lead us to believe that third-party candidates that leave their party tend to consume most of their former party supporters. And so Betsy Johnson probably did better amongst Democrats. And so if you gave people ranked choice voting, that second choice, Johnson would have been the lowest, would probably go more toward Tina Kotek. And so I think you would probably still have had the same result. I would be surprised if people selected Betsy Johnson first and then had their second preference as Christine Drazan. So I don't think there would be that much of a difference in the ultimate outcome.
Interesting. I'm seeing David nodding yes. All right, anyone else? Okay, all right, Heath, next question.
What are your thoughts on using electoral college in the state to address the divide? Does that make sense?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure I
Yeah, I'm not sure.
understand it, but we'll
Yeah.
see if any of our panelists.
I think what the question is referring to is like if you allocate a certain number of votes for the governor based on how a county or a particular area votes. I mean, my sense is that there's a reason that other countries and that states throughout the US don't use an electoral college model. And I think it's because it's completely stupid. And it's a kind of a ridiculous anachronistic type of mechanism, that just has its roots in, late 1700s American politics that just isn't relevant anymore. So I don't think it would be helpful. I mean, imagine, the reporter saying, hey, if Tina Kotek can pull it off here in Tillamook County, right, she's going to win the election, and having it all come down to something like that. I don't think that would be an improvement.
I guess I just think hypothetically, and maybe what I'm curious to know what Brent's thoughts of this are, and that then you'd probably have overrepresentation in rural counties. So rural counties would count for more. And then would you feel better about your position in the state? So my mother-in-law, I hate to bring up in this example, but it's from Eastern Oregon, says, it feels demoralizing voting and constantly losing and not feeling like I have a voice. And so then I think she's a supporter of the Greater Idaho movement. And so I wonder if your voice was overrepresented, would you feel the same way? Maybe you would have less votes for seceding to Greater Idaho.
Interesting. All right. Next question, Heath.
I'm not sure if you all are familiar with how pollsters do their work, but the question is, some pollsters are beginning to count on focus groups more than their surveys. Have you heard this? Any comments?
So I can talk about an academic research. So the response rates for regular, I do a lot of survey research there, gone down and down and down. And so now they're using target groups, people that are paid, to respond to surveys. They try to match them up with what the US Census looks like. And so these people get paid, and then they're representative demographically, economically, and stuff of what the US is. And so in a sense, it's not a focus group, what we would call it, but it's kind of the same idea. And so I've heard a little bit of that from some lobbyists in Oregon, how they approach, campaigns and on various issues. So I don't know how to actually answer that, but I've seen trends like that on the academic side. And I might add too, yeah, I did have a mess up on Lynn County voters. I just looked I put in Lynn County twice, so I fixed it. I just fixed the PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that, and I'll load it up so people can get it off my website.
Oh, that was one of the other questions is, will people have access to your slides after this presentation?
Yeah,
For everybody?
we could load them, yeah, and that we could, I don't know if
Okay.
the League of Women Voters has a website or something, but we could
Yeah.
load them up on, okay, we can
Great.
send them to you. Okay.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Let
Heath,
me
I
make a
think,
quick
I
want to
think,
make a quick
oh,
comment about polling.
go
if
ahead,
that's
Chris.
okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
just that the polling overall was pretty good in this election, particularly independent polls. And I think Dave pointed out that Republicans had kind of flooded the market with partisan polling toward the last couple of weeks to change the narrative. And so I think the expectation was Republicans would have done well. And so people then look at the polls now and think, well, the polls messed up yet again, similar to 2020. But I think a lot of that relies on these partisan polls, which are intentionally meant to boost Republicans' chances for the reasons I think David pointed out. But independent polls, particularly even at the state in competitive states, were really accurate in this cycle.
Okay.
Heath, do you have one zinger for the
sure.
end?
I don't know if it's a zinger, but how do you have any projections on how the changing demographics of the country might influence political polarization? It doesn't have a time frame though, so you get to pick your own.
Catherine, is your Zoom working? I know a while back you said you were having some problems. Do you want to
Yeah, I got
comment on that?
yeah. Oh, that's a tough one. Well, so the demographics definitely, if the trends continue, favor the Democratic Party. Well, no, I want to back off on that. Because we're an aging society. So, right, fertility rates are going down. To the extent that, is it an aging or a cohort effect is the question that we struggle with. Do people become more conservative as they get older, or are there just more conservative cohorts, and will people kind of who are generally left going to stay with that going forward? We see the parties changing and what they represent and what they mean to people over time. So the Republican Party of today is not the Republican Party that we grew up with in the 80s. So people who used to be Republican have now left the party and they don't know where they belong. And so the demographics are changing, but the parties are changing. And so I would be hesitant to offer my prediction. Maybe my colleagues are braver.
Anybody brave out there to get out your crystal ball and tell us what you think?
Well, a lot of stuff I thought would happen in the US by now is wrong. In terms of value change and having some of the politics we have now, I thought things are going to change, based on, how I was trained and research I've done, things like that. I didn't think we would be in the situation we are right now with the polarization and the really just mean-spirited politics and stuff. I thought we wouldn't be like this by now. So I was very optimistic. So I'm still confronted with my younger view of what would happen in the future. So I still have hope though.
Well, that's good.
And there's another element to this, in that there's a bit of a disconnect between people's partisan identification and the positions that they take on certain issues. So, for example, you will often see, decent majorities approving increases in the minimum wage, or in Kansas, for example, a majority, approving to allow the right to abortion, for example. But then when these issues are removed from a party label and people have a chance to weigh in on them in and of themselves, things like same-sex marriage or legalization of marijuana, you definitely do see some change over time in people's views on some of these issues.
All right. Well, it's almost 8:30. So I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your sharing your time and your expertise with us. And thanks to Heath for monitoring the question. And we hope that tonight's program has informed everyone to become even better citizens in their voting. And in closing, we just want to extend an invitation. If any of you in our audience would like to be an active citizen and an informed voter, we hope you will become a league member. Next month, our local league will be sponsoring a program related to climate change. And in January, we'll sponsor our annual Know Your City series. Our local league also has several active committees on climate change, community planning, housing, justice, and voter education. And I know that any one of those committees would love to have you join. Finally, although our local league is an all-volunteer organization, our work does require financial support. And right now we're having our annual fruit sale fundraiser. So you can support the league and enjoy a box of grapefruit or oranges at the same time. The cost is $35 a box. It's delivered to you the first week of December, and the profits help the league serve the community with voter education, registration, legislative updates, voter forums, and a lot more. So please go to our website. I don't know if Jessica or Heath wants to put the website into the chat there, so you have it. So go to the website if you would like to join the league and become a more informed voter and be more actively engaged in issues that really matter. So again, thank you to everyone, especially to our panelists. Again, we really appreciate your time, your expertise, and hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Annette.
Sure. Bye-bye now.